Well, I mean, Muslim intellectual life really takes its cue from the Quran. So you'll find many of the topics or developments within Muslim intellectual disciplines are very much grounded in the Quran. And so the Quranic commentaries become the arena, if you like, the place where many of these discussions are debated, grounded within the Quranic text, developed and transmitted to later generations. So that's its main role, really, in the sense that it's a vehicle for the transmission of ideas, intellectual ideas that take their cue from the Quran very much. How this anthology contributes, well, because it really is, it documents, in a sense, it's giving us a snapshot, or snapshots, if you like, into that intellectual development from the point of view of grammar, theology, law, Quranic commentaries, all these things. These all come into play in Quranic texts. So, especially because the anthology spans some 13 centuries of Muslim history, we are able to, if you like, document developments in theology, in law and grammar, and the field itself. So it really is a window into the time into which a particular commentary is written, and the record of those intellectual developments. Well, the gap in scholarship is primarily to do with the accessibility of these texts to a readership which has no Arabic. Particularly now, more and more, that there are many more students of Islamic studies in universities across the West who have a very limited knowledge or familiarity with the Arabic language, but want, through their studies, primarily through the medium of English, have a kind of taste of the way in which Muslims have interacted with their scripture. And I think primarily that's the gap that we are addressing, because there really is very little in the terms of Quranic commentary translated into English. And so that's the kind of, if you like, principal gap that we're addressing. Well, exactly in that sort of area by students really of Islamic studies in the West, particularly students of comparative religious studies. They can then look at the kind of interpretive tradition if they're looking comparatively in the Jewish and the Christian traditions, and also now look in the Muslim tradition. So really giving them access to the field of Muslim exegesis in English. But also actually even for advanced students of Islamic studies, because it is a kind of it's an easy reference point for many of the really principal figures of Muslim exegesis, that they are able to consult the anthology, look up, find out who these figures were, and it's of course through the copious annotation that is in the anthology. I think it'll facilitate research for masters, or even those embarking on their PhDs in Islamic studies. It will be really a kind of a very important reference tool. The theme for this volume was God, the nature of the divine. I mean, that suggests itself as the most obvious choice, really, when you're dealing with the Quran. It is God's words to initially to his prophet, but to the believers at large, and to mankind, according to the Quran's own narrative, if you like. So the theme of God is very obvious, and what we try to do is select those verses which are prominent, not just within the Quran. I mean, there are verses in the Quran that stand out, whether it's because of style, because of their position in the text, or because of the content. But also verses which at the same time are very prominent in the kind of the devotional life of Muslims, and in the arts, I mean artistically, that have appeared, in in all the expressions of art that we associate with Islamic civilization. So some of them, the throne verse, the light verse, the verse about the oneness of God, these are obvious and they're known to most Muslims, kind of grow up knowing them or familiar with them. And then we had to balance that with three other aspects of the divine. And mercy suggested itself as an obvious one, something which the Quran talks about at length. And God's omnipresence, if you like, which is the other one, the verse 115 of the Surah Al-Baqarah. And finally, one to do with God's creation, and because it speaks about the measure that God uses in His creation, the precise measure, reflecting God's excellence of creation, if you like, and His wisdom. So we try to balance different attributes of the divine. And the commentaries were simply, we tried to cover across time, zigzagging our way through time, as many of the confessional communities and intellectual traditions that we could. So that was the principal criteria. Well, situating it within the overall trend, there has been in the last decade an increasing focus on Muslim commentaries, but these studies have primarily been really monographic studies of individual commentaries or commentators. And this is really our contribution here, is to try and give some kind of overview or a window into many different kinds of commentators, drawing on different intellectual and confessional traditions. And the reason why nothing of the sort has appeared is really a very practical one. I think something of this sort requires competence in many sub-disciplines, such as the ones I mentioned, theology, Islamic jurisprudence, pre-Islamic poetry, Arabic grammar, philosophical traditions, philosophical discussions, because all of these elements come into play in a Quranic commentary. And so beyond that, also competence, of course, of a certain standard in Arabic. And I think, this kind of work requires, as you can see, we are, this is a co-edited volume, so it requires collaboration and cooperation. And the kind of overall mission, and I think this is where the Quranic studies, it very much, you need a kind of a series in which you can present these volumes, because you need, quite simply, you need the funding, you need the cooperation of fellow scholars, and you need the competence in many fields. So usually all these things are not forthcoming in a single individual, so it's very difficult to kind of expect many works of this kind, but that's the reason. Well, the Mufassirun quite simply are the diversity. This is the whole point of having so many commentators in the anthology, is to show that there have been, that is the diversity, since there are many commentarial, if you like, exegetical traditions in Islam. About the plurality, I think it's so that people not misunderstand the approach of Muslim commentators. I think it's not that they necessarily accept that there are plural interpretations of a particular verse. Every community has its own opinion on a verse or an understanding of a particular passage, and of course that's necessarily so, because this is the process of legitimation, if you like, the process of every tradition grounding itself within the Quran. But what is important in terms of when we speak about plurality is appreciating that there was more than one approach that manifested itself within this overall discipline of Quranic study, something which I think is very much lacking in this kind of modern day. So that really is the if you like, the plurality angle, as opposed to them accepting a plurality of views. It's just that they all represent a plurality of approaches. It's significant in the sense, at a certain level, yes, because that's after all why they are different they belong to different communities, and that's why they belong to different intellectual traditions. But I think we find within, I like to see it as a kind of plurality within a uniformity, and the uniformity being the absolute reverence for the text as really a primary, foundational really for the Muslim community. And the engagement with the text across traditions requires, as I said, everybody, all commentators understand that it requires a high degree of competence in jurisprudence, in Arabic language, in theology, and the traditions transmitted from the prophets. So in that sense, they are all working within a discipline. But the plurality manifests itself in that particular tradition or that particular community's understanding of itself with regard to the Quran and to the divine mission of the Prophet. The future plans are present plans. I mean, at the moment, we are working on conceptualizing this second volume that will look at authority, the question of authority and leadership in the Quran. And then there's another one. A colleague of ours here in Quranic Studies is working on a volume on women. So these two volumes are in the making, if you like.